Do you believe in witches? I didn't at first. Then I did. In fact, I can prove it. The first time I saw her was at the farmer's market, hunched over a table of dried herbs and crystals. Most people hurried past, avoiding eye contact with the elderly woman whose weathered face bore a map of deep wrinkles. Her long silver hair hung in unkempt tangles around her shoulders, and her gnarled fingers arranged and rearranged small bundles of sage and rosemary with obsessive precision. The autumn wind carried the mingled scents of apples, cinnamon, and something else. Something older and earthier that I couldn't quite identify. I wouldn't have paid her much attention either, except that my best friend Lauren was going through a witchy phase and had dragged me there looking for supplies for her latest ritual. Lauren had always been drawn to the unconventional, cycling through interests like most people cycle through seasonal wardrobes. Last year it had been astrology. Before that, meditation and crystal healing. I'd learned to humor her enthusiasms while maintaining my own steadfast skepticism. While Lauren excitedly examined the herbs, practically bouncing on her toes as she picked up various bundles and inhaled their fragrance, I stood back, rolling my eyes at the whole scene. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos, planning to share them later in our group chat with suitably sarcastic captions. "You mock what you don't understand, child," the old woman suddenly spoke, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place, something Eastern European perhaps, but distorted by age and what sounded like centuries of wisdom. Her pale blue eyes locked onto mine with unsettling intensity. They were the color of ice over deep water, and just as cold. "I'm not mocking anything," I lied, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "I'm just waiting for my friend." I quickly lowered my phone, though I knew she couldn't have seen the captions I'd been mentally composing. The old woman's lips curved into a knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The veil between worlds grows thin, and still you choose blindness. Perhaps you need to see clearly to understand the cost of your derision." Her fingers never stopped moving as she spoke, weaving complex patterns with sprigs of herbs I didn't recognize. Before I could respond, Lauren had completed her purchases, clutching a paper bag filled with bundles of dried plants and what looked like a small leather-bound book. As we walked away, I couldn't resist turning back for one last glance. The old woman was still watching me, her lips moving in what appeared to be silent words. For just a moment, though I later convinced myself it was a trick of the light, I thought I saw symbols floating in the air around her, glowing faintly like embers from a dying fire. That night, the dreams began. At first, they were subtle, whispered voices just beyond my understanding, shadows moving at the corner of my vision. But each night they grew stronger, more vivid. I would find myself walking through endless dark corridors, following the sound of someone weeping. The walls would pulse with an otherworldly green light, and no matter which direction I turned, I could never find the source of the crying. I began dreading sleep. Each night, the dreams became more elaborate, more terrifying. I found myself in ancient libraries where the books bled real blood when opened, their pages filled with writing that crawled across the paper like insects. I wandered through massive ballrooms where dancers in medieval masks whirled to music that sounded like screaming, their feet never touching the ground. I fled from things that wore the faces of my loved ones, but moved in ways that human bodies should never move. After a week, I started seeing things while awake. Brief glimpses of faces in windows, the sound of footsteps following me when I was alone, the smell of burning herbs appearing suddenly in empty rooms. I tried to convince myself it was just stress, lack of sleep, an overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew better. The worst part was that no one else could see what was happening. When I desperately pointed out the shadow figure standing in the corner of my office, my coworkers exchanged worried glances. When I screamed at the sight of long gray fingers reaching out from under my bed, my roommate suggested I talk to someone about anxiety. My work began to suffer. How could I focus on spreadsheets and meetings when I kept seeing ancient symbols appearing and disappearing on my computer screen? How could I maintain professional composure when every reflective surface showed glimpses of another world superimposed over our own? A world where the streets were paved with bones and the sky was filled with watching eyes? Lauren tried to help, but her newfound interest in witchcraft seemed laughably inadequate in the face of what was happening to me. She burned sage in my apartment and drew protective circles with salt, but the entities that now haunted my life simply laughed at her amateur attempts to banish them. The laughter would echo through my rooms long after she left, growing deeper and more distorted until it sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. I returned to the farmer's market the following weekend, but the old woman's stall was empty. None of the other vendors seemed to remember her, though they'd been selling beside her just a week before. One elderly man even insisted that particular spot had been vacant for months. When I showed him the photos I'd taken on my phone, my blood ran cold. Where the old woman had stood, there was only a dark, blurry shape that seemed to shift and change even as we looked at it. The manifestations grew more aggressive. Books would fly off shelves when I passed. Mirrors would crack in perfect spiral patterns. My phone would ring with calls from unknown numbers, and when I answered, I would hear only the sound of ancient, wheezing laughter. Sometimes the calls would show as coming from my own number, but with impossible timestamps, calls from 300 years in the future or 2,000 years in the past. One night, I woke to find my kitchen had rearranged itself into a perfect mandala pattern. Every dish, utensil, and appliance placed with geometric precision on the floor in an elaborate circular design. When I tried to move a single spoon, everything crashed to the floor simultaneously. But in the morning, nothing was broken, and everything was back in its proper place. Only the pattern remained, burned into my wooden floor like a giant brand. 2 weeks after my encounter with the old woman, I woke to find my bedroom walls covered in symbols drawn in what looked like ash. They seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, forming words and languages that had never existed in our world. When I touched one, my finger came away clean. But for the rest of the day, that symbol appeared everywhere I looked, branded into the surfaces of the world like a signature I couldn't escape. Desperate, I reached out to Lauren. Despite her recent interest in witchcraft, she admitted she was just a dabbler and suggested we seek help from someone with real experience. After several days of searching, we found a genuine practitioner who agreed to meet with us. Her shop was hidden in a part of the city I'd never noticed before, though I passed that street every day on my way to work. The building seemed to exist in a space between other buildings, like a paragraph inserted between the lines of an already written page. The woman, who introduced herself simply as Maria, listened to my story without interruption. Her dark eyes grew increasingly troubled as I described the escalating phenomena. When I finished, she closed her eyes and was silent for a long moment. The candles in her shop flickered in a wind I couldn't feel. "The one you encountered was no ordinary witch," she finally said. "She is known as the Mirror Witch, and her curses are designed to reflect the victim's own skepticism and derision back upon them. The more you dismiss the reality of magic, the more aggressively it now forces itself into your life." Maria's fingers traced patterns in the air as she spoke, leaving trailing lines of blue light that slowly faded. "How do I make it stop?" I pleaded. Maria's expression was grave. "The curse will end when you truly believe, not just out of fear or desperation, but with genuine acceptance of what exists beyond the veil of ordinary reality. But be warned. Once you open your eyes to these truths, they can never be closed again. You will see the world as it truly is, with all its wonder and terror." She went to a shelf and began gathering supplies. Herbs I recognized from the old woman's stall, crystals that hummed faintly when she touched them, a small silver bell that rang with a tone that made my teeth ache. "This ritual will help open your inner eye," she explained, "but the real work must come from you. You must learn to accept that your understanding of reality was incomplete and be willing to embrace a much larger, stranger universe." The ritual itself was deceptively simple. At midnight, I was to create a circle of salt and sit within it, surrounding myself with specific herbs and crystals. I would ring the bell 3 times, then drink a tea Maria had prepared. "The tea will help you see," she said, "but what you do with that sight is up to you." That night, as I prepared to perform the ritual, I caught a glimpse of the old woman from the market in my bathroom mirror. She smiled that same cold smile and nodded once before vanishing. But this time I noticed something I hadn't before. Behind her, reflected in the mirror, was not my bathroom, but a vast library that seemed to stretch into infinity, its shelves reaching up into darkness where impossible constellations gleamed. The ritual worked, though not in the way I expected. The supernatural events didn't stop. If anything, they increased. But I slowly learned to see them for what they were, glimpses into a world that had always existed alongside our own, one that most people choose not to see. The terrifying became fascinating. The impossible became mundane. I learned that the shadow creatures I'd feared were actually guardians, ancient spirits that protected the boundaries between worlds. The whispers I heard were conversations between beings that existed in the spaces between moments. The symbols that appeared everywhere were parts of a vast language that described the true nature of reality, a language I slowly began to understand. Now, years later, I can't walk down a street without noticing the fairy lights dancing in dark alleys, or the ancient beings that disguise themselves as homeless people, or the symbols of power hidden in plain sight on building corners. I've learned to navigate this deeper reality, to show proper respect to its denizens, and to never, ever mock what I don't understand. Lauren still practices her witchcraft, though now she comes to me for guidance. I've taught her to see beyond the superficial trappings of ritual to the true currents of power that flow through all things. Sometimes when the moon is right, we sit in my garden and watch the flowers bloom in impossible colors, their petals opening to reveal tiny worlds contained within. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the wind carries the scent of sage, I think I see the old woman from the market. She's always in crowds, always watching. And sometimes when our eyes meet, she gives me that same knowing smile. But now I understand it's not cruel. It's recognition. Recognition of another person who can finally see the world as it truly is, in all its beautiful and terrible glory. The price of her curse was my ignorance, and though the journey was frightening, I'm no longer sure it was a curse at all. Perhaps it was a gift, one that I wasn't ready to receive until I learned true humility in the face of forces I once dismissed so carelessly. But I still warn everyone I meet, be careful how you treat the strange old woman at the market. Some lessons are harder to learn than others, and not everyone survives the education. For every person like me who learns to swim in these deeper waters, there are others who drown in the vastness of what they discover. Their stories don't have endings as happy as mine. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm walking home through streets that seem to shift and change with each step, I wonder if my story is really over at all. Because now I understand that every ending is just another beginning, and there are always more mysteries to uncover, more wonders to behold, and more terrible truths waiting to be discovered by those brave enough or foolish enough to look beyond the veil of ordinary reality. Just remember, the next time you see an old woman selling herbs at a market, think twice before you roll your eyes. You never know who might be watching, or what lessons they might decide you need to learn.